"They've sent a message, Admiral," Lieutenant Morvock said, his tone dripping with derision. He handed Gurroth a datapad. "A request for parley. It seems they're aware of our arrival." Gurroth chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Typical. They think words can stave off their inevitable assimilation. Have we scanned their defenses?" "Yes, sir," Morvock replied. "Minimal energy signatures. No orbital platforms. No shielding grids. The most curious reading is kinetic artillery. Cannons, missiles, and," he paused, smirking as if the words themselves were absurd, "something called a howitzer." Gurroth's sneer deepened. "How quaint. They're preparing to face a dragon with spears and stones." Down on the surface, in the human colony of Novatera, Captain Roland Roy was far from amused. In the dimly lit war room, he stood before a battered table covered in maps, schematics, and data sheets. His team, a collection of hardened soldiers and engineers, awaited his orders. "We can't outgun them," Roy said, his voice steady but grim. "Not in the conventional sense. Their ships can level this colony from orbit if they choose." One of the men, a wiry sergeant named Tanner, bristled. "So what's the plan? Roll over and let them take us." "No," Roy said sharply, fixing Tanner with a steely gaze. "We make them bleed. We show them that humanity isn't as weak as they think. They've dismissed us as primitive, but that's their mistake. We're not just fighting for this colony. We're fighting to send a message." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Among the group was Private Lucas Greer, the youngest of the team and a recent transfer from Earth's Defense Corps. His hands clenched in a fist at the thought of surrender. He had grown up hearing stories of humanity's resilience, of battles won against impossible odds. Now, standing at the precipice of annihilation, he was determined to prove the stories true. "What about the howitzer, sirs?" Greer asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Roy allowed himself a small, grim smile. "The howitzer is our ace. They've never seen anything like it. An ancient weapon by their standards, but one with a power they can't comprehend. If we use it strategically, it might give us the edge we need." Meanwhile, aboard the Yography, Gurroth was indulging in a private briefing with his senior officers. The humans' request for peace had been reviewed and dismissed, their terms deemed laughably naive. The hologram of Captain Roy, standing tall despite the overwhelming odds, replayed before them. His defiance amused the officers, eliciting chuckles and scoffs. "He doesn't know his place," said Commander Varick, one of Gurroth's most trusted advisors. "No," Gurroth replied, his voice dripping with disdain. "But he will. Morvock, prepare a detachment to land near their settlement. Let's see how these primitives react when they meet the might of the Empire face to face." Hours later, the Empire's shimmering dropships broke through Novatera's atmosphere, their descent marked by streaks of light that lit the evening sky. They landed with mechanical precision just outside the human colony, where Roy and his men awaited. The Empire's soldiers marched forward in perfect formation, clad in gleaming armor and wielding energy rifles that hummed with deadly power. At their head, Lieutenant Morvock stepped forward, a picture of smug superiority. He scanned the human defenders with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on the howitzer position on a nearby hill. The massive artillery piece, ancient and weathered, stood as a testament to human ingenuity and determination. "This is your defense," Morvock said, laughing openly. "An old cannon? I almost feel sorry for you." Roy stepped forward, his expression unyielding. "You underestimate us at your peril." Morvock's laughter faded. "Bold words for a dead man walking. You have until sunrise to surrender. Refuse, and we'll show you what real power looks like." As the Empire's forces withdrew, Roy turned to his men. "Let them mock. Tomorrow, they'll learn what we're capable of. Above, aboard the Yography." Gurroth watched the scene unfold on a live feed. He was confident, as always, but a small part of him was intrigued. The humans were defiant, Yes, but could there be more to their resolve than mere bravado? He dismissed the thought almost as soon as it arose. They'll fall, he said aloud, more to reassure himself than his officers. Just like all the others, back in Nova Terra, Roy and his men worked through the night, preparing for the battle ahead. Greer stood by the Howitzer, running his hands over its metal surface as if drawing strength from its solid, unyielding presence. They think we're relics, he said quietly to Tanner, who stood nearby, that we're too weak to matter. They're in for a rude awakening. Tanner replied with a grim smile. Let's make them regret ever crossing us. As dawn approached, the human defenders took their positions. The Howitzer gleamed in the early light, a symbol of humanity's defiance. In the distance, the Empire's forces began to stir, their ranks readying for the inevitable clash. Roy took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This is it, he said. No surrender, no retreat. Let's show them what humanity is made of. The dawn broke over Nova Terra, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. For a fleeting moment, the colony seemed untouched by the looming shadow of destruction. Yet, in the distance, the metallic sheen of the Empire's battalions betrayed their readiness. Captain Roland Roy stood atop the ridge overlooking the battlefield, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. The ground below was a tapestry of human ingenuity. Trenches carved hastily into the soil, sandbags stacked high, and the howitzer positioned with painstaking precision. It loomed like a relic of another era, its worn barrel a testament to battles fought long before humanity reached the stars. They're on the move, Sergeant Tanner said, gesturing toward the approaching Imperial forces. Roy nodded. Good. Let them come to us. They'll expect us to falter the moment their advanced tech overwhelms us. He turned to Private Lucas Greer, who was methodically checking the howitzer's firing mechanisms. Greer, ready that cannon. Timing will be everything. Greer straightened, saluting sharply. Yes, sir. We won't let you down. The Empire's troops advanced with machine-like precision. Rows of soldiers clad in polished armor marched in unison, their plasma rifles glinting in the sunlight. Hovering above them were swarms of sleek drones, their faint hum a reminder of the technological chasm between the two forces. Leading the charge was Lieutenant Morvock, his swagger betraying his overconfidence. Look at them, Morvock sneered, his voice crackling over the comms to his squad, clinging to their primitive weapons like children holding sticks. Let's give them a lesson in modern warfare. The first salvo came from the Empire, a barrage of energy blasts designed to test the humans' defenses. The trenches erupted in fire and debris, but the soldiers held their ground. Roy barked orders with precision, directing his men to targeted positions. Wait for my command, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The energy shields worn by the Imperial infantry deflected most of the human bullets, but the howitzer was another matter entirely. At Roy's signal, Greer adjusted the angle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Fire, Roy shouted. The howitzer roared to life, its deep thunder shaking the ground. The shell hurtled through the air, its trajectory calculated to strike the center of the Imperial formation. When it landed, the explosion was deafening, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. Soldiers were thrown like rag dolls, their shields proving useless against the sheer kinetic force. Morvock staggered backward, momentarily stunned. What was that? He barked, his arrogance replaced by confusion. How did they... Another shell landed, this time taking out a group of drones. The Imperial advance faltered, their ranks in disarray. For the first time, the humans' defiance seemed more than just an act of desperation. They're adapting, Roy said, watching the enemy scramble to regroup. But so are we. Greer, keep the pressure on them. Target their command units. Yes, sir, Greer replied, his voice tinged with adrenaline. He adjusted the howitzer again, sweat dripping down his face. Each shot was a calculated strike, dismantling the Empire's confidence piece by piece. Admiral Garoth watched the battle unfold from the Yogurthi, his expression darkening with each report. The live feed displayed scenes of chaos. Imperial soldiers falling back, their formations broken. "They're using that thing," Garoth said, gesturing toward the Howitzer on the holographic display. "A relic from a forgotten era. Yet it's crippling our forces." Commander Varric shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Perhaps we underestimated their ability to adapt, Admiral. Their knowledge of the terrain and use of unconventional tactics." Garoth silenced him with a glare. "Enough. I won't hear excuses. Deploy the heavy mechs. Let's remind them why the Empire reigns supreme." Back on the battlefield, the humans watched as massive mechanical walkers emerged from the Imperial ranks. Towering over the troops, the mechs bristled with weapons, energy cannons, missile pods, and plasma shields. Their appearance silenced the cheers that had begun to ripple through the human lines. "Here comes the real test," Roy said. "Greer, think you can bring one of those down?" Greer grinned despite the odds. "I'll need a clear shot, sir." "You'll get it," Roy promised, signaling to his men. "Draw their fire. Make them think we're scattered." The human soldiers moved with purpose, retreating strategically to create pockets of vulnerability. The mechs lumbered forward, their cannons firing indiscriminately, reducing trenches to smoldering craters. But the howitzer remained untouched, hidden behind a ridge. As one of the mechs reached the crest of a hill, Greer seized his opportunity. He calibrated the shot, every calculation etched into his mind. "Firing," he called out. The shell arced high, a streak of metal cutting through the sky. It struck the mech's jointed leg, the explosion ripping through the structure with surgical precision. The machine toppled, crashing to the ground in a cacophony of metal and fire. "Direct hit," Tanner shouted, his voice filled with exhilaration. The Imperial forces hesitated, their confidence shaken. Roy seized a moment. "Push forward. Show them what humanity can do." The humans surged with renewed vigor, exploiting every weakness in the Empire's formation. Another mech fell, its pilot's screams drowned out by the roar of the howitzer. On board the Yogurthi, Garoth clenched his fists. "Unacceptable," he growled. "They're primitives, and yet they—" He stopped himself, taking a slow breath. "Prepare the orbital cannons. If they refuse to kneel, we'll obliterate them." As the day wore on, the battlefield became a testament to human resilience. Greer, exhausted but determined, continued to fire shot after shot, his every movement fueled by the belief that they could win. Roy moved among his men, issuing orders and lifting morale, his leadership the glue holding them together. Finally, as dusk settled over the colony, the Imperial forces withdrew to regroup. The howitzer stood silent, its barrel smoking, a monument to the humans' defiance. Roy surveyed the battlefield, his jaw set. "They'll be back," he said. "And when they come, they'll bring everything they've got." Greer leaned against the howitzer, wiping soot from his face. "Then we'll hit them harder." The aftermath of the day's battle settled, like an uneasy fog over Novidera. Smoke rose from craters littering the once green fields, mingling with the scent of scorched earth and the acrid tang of plasma burns. Amid the ruins of the battlefield, Captain Roland Roy stood on the ridge, his gaze locked on the distant glimmer of the Imperial forces, regrouping under the cover of darkness. Their retreat earlier had been temporary, a prelude to the full fury that was sure to follow. "We made them bleed," Sergeant Tanner said, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "They won't forget today." Roy nodded but didn't smile. "No, they won't. But arrogance runs deep. They'll return with more firepower and fewer doubts about using it." In the dim light of the command tent, the human leaders gathered for an urgent briefing. Maps and tactical diagrams cluttered the table as Roy outlined their strategy. Every man present knew the odds hadn't shifted in their favor. If anything, the Empire's losses would spur an escalation. "We can't win a war of attrition," Roy began, his voice firm but weighted. "We have one advantage: They're still underestimating us. Today's victory wasn't enough to break their belief in their superiority, but it was enough to make them impatient. They'll push harder tomorrow, and that impatience will make them vulnerable. Private Lucas Greer leaned forward, his youthful face marred by fatigue but lit with resolve. "And the Howitzer, sir? What's its role in the next strike?" Roy glanced at him. "It's our linchpin. You proved its worth today, Greer. Now we'll take it further. The mechs were tough, but they're vulnerable at their joints and power cores. If we can cripple their central unit tomorrow, their cohesion will shatter." As the men dispersed, Greer lingered by the Howitzer, running his hand along its cold, soot-streaked barrel. His father had once told him that true strength wasn't in the weapon, but in the will to wield it. That lesson carried him now, through the fear and exhaustion, as he prepared for what he knew would be the Empire's most brutal assault yet. Admiral Gurrow stood in the command center of the Yagothy, his mood a volatile mix of anger and calculation. The holographic display of the battlefield replayed the humans' unorthodox defense. The Howitzer, a relic by Imperial standards, had defied every expectation. The footage showed its devastating strikes, each one a blow not only to the Empire's forces, but to Gurrow's pride. "We underestimated them," Commander Varric admitted, breaking the tense silence. "Their use of terrain and—" "Spare me the excuses," Gurrow snapped, his crimson cloak swishing as he turned to face his officers. "Deploy the Omega Division. Heavy artillery mechs, assault drones, and orbital suppression fire. I want that colony reduced to ash." Varric hesitated. "Admiral, if we escalate further—" "They've embarrassed the Empire," Gurrow interrupted, his voice icy. "If we don't crush them decisively, other colonies may believe they can resist. This is no longer about conquest. It's about reasserting dominance." At dawn, the Empire's full might descended upon Novaterra. The sky darkened as massive dropships disgorged columns of towering mechs, each bristling with weaponry far more advanced than anything the humans had faced before. Above them, swarms of drones cast shadows over the battlefield, their high-pitched whine a constant reminder of the overwhelming force closing in. From the ridge, Roy watched the scene unfold through binoculars. "They've brought everything," he murmured. "Just as we planned." Greer stood beside him, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the Howitzer. Despite the fear, his eyes were steady. "We can stop them, sir. One shot at a time." Roy clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, Greer. Remember, precision over panic. Every shot counts." The battle began with a ferocity unmatched by the previous skirmishes. Plasma cannons and missile pods rained destruction upon the human defenses, reducing trenches to smoldering ruins. The humans responded with guerrilla tactics, moving in small teams to outflank the lumbering mechs and target weak points. "Focus fire on their legs," Roy shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "If they can't move, they can't fight." Greer adjusted the Howitzer, sweat dripping down his face as he zeroed in on a massive mech leading the Imperial charge. Its energy shield shimmered with an almost impenetrable glow, but Roy had identified a flaw, an exposed cooling vent near the core. "Firing," Greer called out, and the Howitzer roared to life. The shell struck true, piercing the mech's shield and detonating within its vent. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves through the Imperial line as the mech collapsed in a cascade of fire and shrapnel. Cheers erupted from the human soldiers, but the battle was far from over. From his vantage point aboard the Yagothy, Gurrow watched the mech's destruction with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "That weapon should be useless against modern shields." Commander Varric studied the feed. "They're adapting their tactics, using precision strikes to exploit vulnerabilities." "It's impressive." "Impressive?" Gurrow's voice was venomous. "It's insubordination on a galactic scale. Ready the orbital cannons. If our forces can't finish them, I will." Back on the ground, the tide of battle shifted as the Empire unleashed its next wave. Orbital suppression fire. Bright streaks of energy rained down from the heavens, carving through human defenses with merciless precision. Roy dove for cover as a blast vaporized the ridge where he had been standing moments before. "They're escalating," he said grimly. "Greer, can you hit their command relay?" Greer wiped soot from his face, his hands steady despite the chaos. "I'll need a clear shot, sir." "You'll have it," Roy promised. He motioned to his men. "Cover fire. Draw their attention." The soldiers surged forward, firing at the advancing mechs and drones, creating enough distraction for Greer to align the howitzer. Through the smoke and fire, he spotted his target. A relay station perched atop a hill, its antennae glowing as it coordinated the Empire's assault. "Locked on!" Greer shouted. The howitzer thundered once more, and the shells streaked toward the relay. Time seemed to freeze as it struck, the explosion sending shards of metal and fire cascading into the air. The Imperial forces hesitated, their communications disrupted, their assault faltering. "We did it," Tanner shouted, a rare grin breaking his usually stoic demeanor. For the first time, Roy allowed himself a small smile. "It's not over yet, but we bought ourselves time." Above, Gurl's expression darkened as the relay's destruction flashed on the monitor. His fury simmered into something colder, more dangerous. "Pull back the ground forces," he ordered. "Prepare the fleet for full orbital bombardment. If the ground cannot contain them, we'll bury them from the stars." Back on the battlefield, Roy watched the Empire's retreat with a mix of relief and dread. "They're regrouping," he said, "and when they come back, it'll be with everything they have." Greer, slumped against the howitzer, glanced up. "Then we'll be ready." The air over Novidera was thick with tension as the Empire's final offensive began. The once pristine skies were now marred by the streaks of descending Imperial dropships, their ominous silhouettes cutting through the clouds like harbingers of doom. Captain Roland Roy stood at the forefront of the human resistance, his weathered face a mask of determination as he watched the Imperial forces descend upon the planet for one last push. "Their fleet's already in orbit," Sergeant Tanner said, wiping his brow as he looked up at the darkening sky. "This is it, sir. They're going to try and flatten everything." Roy nodded, his mind racing through strategies. They had already endured 2 waves of overwhelming force, but now the Empire was deploying everything they had left: orbital bombardment, elite assault troops, and the dreaded Omega mechs. The battlefield had become a contest of attrition, and humanity was on the verge of breaking. But Roy knew that this final stand would decide their future. The howitzer, battered but unbroken, sat ready, positioned just behind a ridge that overlooked the valley below. Despite the relentless pounding, it remained humanity's last line of defense, its worn barrel a symbol of resilience. Greer was at its controls, his face set with grim resolve. "They'll be expecting us to scatter when the orbital fire starts," Roy said, eyes scanning the horizon. "We can't let them break our lines. We'll need to make every shot count." Private Lucas Greer, still only 19, adjusted his cap and nodded. "Ready, sir. One more shot, and we'll end this." The first wave of Imperial assault began in the distance, massive, heavily armored mechs clanking toward their positions, flanked by rows of drones scanning the area. From his vantage point, Roy saw the Empire's strategic intent. They planned to overwhelm their human adversaries by sheer numbers, using brute force to crush any remaining resistance. The orbital bombardment would precede their ground assault, a terrifying double strike. "They've got us pinned," Tanner said, his voice low but steady. "No way we can take on those mechs head-on with what we've got." "We won't have to," Roy replied. "Greer, wait for my command." The howitzer's barrel loomed like the head of a serpent, pointed straight at the approaching mechs. Greer's fingers hovered over the firing controls, ready to unleash humanity's final strike. Roy turned to his men. "Remember what we're fighting for," he said, his voice resonating through the gathering storm. "We're not just defending Novidera. We're defending every colony the Empire thought it could crush with its might. Our families, our future. We hold this ground or we die trying. His men didn't respond with words, but their faces spoke volumes. Each man knew the stakes, and they were prepared to see this through to the bitter end. On board the Yography, Admiral Gurov paced before the war table, his eyes cold with contempt as he watched the humans regroup below. The time for patience had passed. Their rebellion had become more than an irritation. It was an affront to imperial authority, a stain on the Empire's invincibility. "We will crush them now," Gurov said, his voice calm but filled with icy malice. Launch the orbital bombardment. Above, the first wave of energy beams streaked across the sky, their incandescent trails a testament to the Empire's overwhelming firepower. The ground below shook as massive explosions rocked the valley, sending clouds of dirt and debris into the air. For a moment, it seemed as though the planet itself might break beneath the bombardment. But Roy didn't flinch. He had seen this before. The human resistance had weathered worse. "Now, Greer," Roy commanded, his voice carrying over the roar of the bombardment. Greer's fingers slammed down on the firing lever. The Howitzer's deep-throated roar echoed across the valley as the shells shot forward, cutting through the chaos. For a heartbeat, it seemed to hang in the air, an angel of vengeance, before it struck the first Imperial mech with devastating precision. The mech's outer shield flared brightly, but faltered under the sheer force of the impact. The shell penetrated deep into its core, causing the machine to stagger and collapse with a deafening crash. It didn't even have a chance to retaliate before the second shell followed, and then the third. One by one, the towering mechs fell, their advanced technology no match for the raw power of human ingenuity and firepower. "Impossible," Commander Varric whispered, watching in disbelief as one of the Empire's most formidable mechs was torn apart by the Howitzer's relentless assault. "They're knocking out our mechs with a single shot." Gurov's fist slammed into the console. "No, this cannot be happening. Recalibrate the mechs. Deploy the last of our heavy artillery. I will not allow a band of primitives to destroy us." Despite the Empire's countermeasures, the humans fought with an unyielding tenacity. Greer continued to fire with lethal precision, each shot reducing another mech to a pile of smoldering scrap. Roy barked orders, directing his soldiers to provide cover fire as the enemy fell back, their advance faltering for the first time since the battle began. The roar of the howitzer was constant, punctuated only by the muffled crackle of plasma and explosions. Tanner moved through the battlefield, coordinating with the rest of the human forces to launch tactical strikes against the retreating Imperial units. But it was clear the tide was turning. The Empire was losing control. "Roy!" Tanner called over the comms. "We've got a breach in their lines. If we push now, we can break them." But Roy was already thinking beyond the immediate victory. "We'll hold the line here, Tanner. Focus on keeping them off the howitzer. We need to make sure they don't regroup." Meanwhile, Greer's eyes remained locked on the scope of the howitzer. "Just a few more shots," he said under his breath. Sweat dripped down his face, his entire being focused on the task at hand. Each shot was more than just an attack. It was a statement, a testament to humanity's resolve. The final blow came when Greer fired his last shell, an explosion so massive that it seemed to shake the heavens themselves. The Empire's last heavy artillery mech, its towering form looming in the distance, was obliterated in an instant. The shockwave sent the remaining Imperial forces reeling. They had been outmatched, outsmarted, and outgunned. On board the Yography, Gurov stood frozen, staring at the shattered remnants of his once formidable fleet. The transmission from the ground was clear. Humanity had won. "This is a disgrace," Gurov said, his voice low with rage. "A mere handful of humans, armed with nothing but old technology. They've humiliated us.